Hello and good evening or good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us here again for what is the final session of day 2 of the AVERT International Research Symposium. It has been an absolutely amazing day, and we've got a really fascinating session here today. We're going to have 4 different sessions within this one session, and this session focuses on research that talks to the many complex ways terrorists have and do use online platforms. I'd like to remind you all to type in your questions in the question and answer dialogue box rather than the chat box. I'm not going to introduce the speakers using their bios. These are all available in the conference program. Now, with this session, we are having something a little bit different. Before we hear from our first presenters, Dr. Kamil Yilmaz from Swansea University and Farangiz Atamuradova from Hedayah, who are going to present on their research exploring Islamic State channels on Telegram. We're going to briefly hear from Joost from Moonshot, and Joost is going to provide some information about the broader project and dataset.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. Really appreciate it. And good evening, everyone. Good morning to my fellow panelists and to all others around the world who have been joining this morning. Great. I'm just going to briefly walk us through the coming slides in which we're going to lay the groundwork for the rest of the presentations that will take place during this panel. During the month of September, a group of practitioners and researchers came together to investigate a variety of IS and Atomwaffen division and affiliated groups' Telegram channels as data was retrieved by Tech Against Terrorism. And we're incredibly grateful for Tech Against Terrorism contributions and support throughout this project, because truly without them today, this panel would not have been able to exist. The channels we investigated were primarily public channels. In some cases, amongst the Atomwaffen division dataset, private channels were accessible due to publicly available join links. And this was all followed in line with Tech Against Terrorism's policy on non-engagement, where no engagement with channel members or administrators was undertaken. Hence that there is primarily a focus of the public channel side. And out of the researchers present during the project, those on the left side here today will be presenting, and the others on the right played really a key role in other research areas that you will likely hear more from over the coming months. For both ideologies on the IS side and the right-wing extremist side, 14 different Telegram channels were investigated, which leads us to the IS side. As you can see from these 14 channels, only public channels were investigated, and I think methodologically is very important here to note that the IS findings that will be discussed today are only representative of those of public-facing channels and not of all IS channels. Likewise, the channels were almost exclusively broadcast channels, meaning that one individual user shared content rather than a user interaction channel where active interaction takes place amongst group members. My colleagues, Dr. Kamil Yilmaz and Farangiz Atamuradova, will go more into detail later about the lone interactive channel, provide some key insights from a qualitative perspective as well. And some of the channels mentioned, as you can see here, had a very short lifespan, others a bit longer, including those that actually were taken down during our research tenure. To then move on to the Atomwaffen division channels. The picture was slightly different. Given that many of the channels were already removed, it was therefore designated as unknown to the researchers what type of channel to designate these as. And given that we did not want to speculate about its origin, it received the status of unknown. Similarly to the IS channels, many channels had a very short lifespan, often being taken down or deleted in a matter of a couple of days or weeks. And really following the picture of the channels, we then investigated 3 different areas, which were outlinking, inlinking, and attachments of each ideology in order to get a bigger picture of what is being shared on the Telegram platform. And here we can see some clear differences between the 2 ideologies, with the exception of inlinking. In both cases, there was actually a very low incidence of inlinking, which was often used to in-link to other Telegram channels. Around the topic of attachments, we saw particularly from the IS side, a high volume of attachments. More than 70% of the posts that IS sympathizers shared contained an attachment, be it an image, video, or an audio. And then lastly here, of course, the outlinks, which shows a great difference between the two ideologies. On the one hand, we see very little outlinking taking place from the Atamuradova division side, but a massive number of outlinks coming from the IS side. A very high proportion of outlinks, in this case, more than 12,000, and with a relatively speaking smaller number of posts sharing this. The 15.5% mentioned here is referring to the 1,255 posts that contained one or more outlinks. And this, of course, then begs the question, which is, what were they mostly outlinking to? Here I'm only quickly disclosing the IS side of the outlinks, particularly because the Atamuradova division outlinks was so incredibly small, only around 1% really in comparison to the IS dataset. The domain names here, of course, have been anonymized from, well, due to a do no harm perspective, amongst other reasons. But the most notable finding here is, of course, the sheer volume in terms of outlinks and domains of file sharing platforms. A total of 24 different file sharing platforms have been mentioned in this list, and they will be discussed further during Conor Rees's presentation. So with all this context in mind, and I know I've just thrown loads at you already, but that should set you up really for the rest of these presentations that will follow during this panel. And with that, I think I'm being followed by Dr. Kamil, Yilmaz, and Farangiz Atamuradova to walk us through a comparative analysis of Islamic State Telegram channels. Thank you so much, Lisa, for allowing me to do this.
Good afternoon and good evening to everyone. So for our project, we focused on comparing two ISIS Telegram channels. And as already mentioned, for ethical reasons, we will refer to one of the channels, which was ostensibly more about the Uyghur genocide, as the interactive channel, and the other one, which presented itself as more of a global news outlet, as the broadcast channel. And the reason on this selection and comparison was that there was only one interactive channel, with the rest mainly being of broadcast nature. Next slide, please. So in our analysis of the two channels, we saw that it was critical to have a comparison and an analysis of both the form and the nature of the messages and the content of the messages. And that's what we will be walking you through in the next couple of slides. Next slides, please. So to start with the form, our findings demonstrated that both of the channels visibly made use of the option provided by the platform to share various content with its followers through attachments. And as shown on the slide, 76% of the posts on the interactive channel had some sort of attachment, which was not limited to photos and videos, but as you can see, to stickers, audios, PDF, and so on. And 84% of the content analyzed of the broadcast channel had attachments of videos or photos, and we will explore that more later in the presentation. Next slide, please. So on the use of outlinks of both channels showed that the interactive channel widely used it in their messages, which was 40% of the content, for file sharing or text or image sharing platforms, while the broadcast channel only leveraged outlinks pointing users to either its own page on other platforms or other pro-ISIS posts. And that would make up of 1.6% of the total content analyzed. In the use of hashtags, which differs from the Twitter and Facebook, we could see how there was a wider use of it in the broadcast channel in comparison to the interactive channel. Next slide, please. And looking at the content of these hashtags, the broadcast channel highlighted countries and regions, emphasizing it in their post. And as you can see on the right hand side of the slide, while the interactive channel hashtagged numerous items relating to the situation of Uyghurs in China, as well as ISIS more broadly. And now I'll hand over to my colleague Kamil Yilmaz, who will speak more on the content of these posts. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Farangiz, and hello, everyone. In the analysis of channels content, we first highlight the use of language. The broadcast channel had clear signs of evasion and efforts of maintaining plausible deniability in order to maintain an outlook of an ordinary news outlet, whereas the interactive channel had a lot of expressive language used on various issues and glorifying violence and IS narratives, which indicated that there was no fear of takedown or attempt to evade and surpass detection. Secondly, the messages found in the channels were split between positive representation of the in-group and negative representation of the out-group, with the latter being more prevalent in the discussions. It was interesting to see that the messaging, the out-group did not only include those outside Islam, but also Shiites and other Muslims that they deemed as what our colleague Jan Berger calls the ineligible in-group. Through this, with a broader cast on the out-group, the narrative creates a larger encompassing common enemy and establishing IS as the only hero to fight this enemy. Third, we realized that positive and negative representation is not something random. The users used various discursive strategies. In our dataset, we have at least evidence for 3 different strategies, which may or may not be intended by the users. Predicational strategies are about using predicates like infidel, crusader, atheist in labeling in an outgroups in certain ways, which can be done both qualitatively, explicitly, and implicitly. We saw this strategy only in the interactive channel though. Second strategy refers to framing and representing discourse in particular ways, but the most important aspect of strategy is that the speaker presents his or her involvement in the discourse. The third strategy involves amplifying the same or similar messages, which can be done both qualitatively and quantitatively by repeating the same message, and qualitatively by tuning up the tone of these narratives when it's expected to be tuned down. The latter 2 strategies are used rather indirectly in the broadcast channel. Fourth, we also found that more than 3/4 of posts in both channels included various audiovisuals. These are part of strategies that I just mentioned. The text and the audiovisuals simply complement each other. Here are some examples about these strategies. In the first, pay attention to the words infidel and Taliban dogs, othering Americans and Taliban. In the second example, we clearly see the involvement of the user in the discourse that amplifies IS violence. Given the large number of similar posts, this channel, broadcast channel, is trying to discursively frame and represent IS as a still relevant, all-powerful and ubiquitous force in the world. In the third, the user talks about the extermination of Uyghurs in China and supports it with a child figure and intensifies its moral weight by using the rape analogy and a praying Uyghur woman. This slide includes some examples about audiovisuals. As you can see, the top ones are from the interactive channel. The left one presents Pakistan as an out-group or ineligible in-group, even though Pakistanis are Muslims. The second one is straightforward, but suffice to say that they use images of victimized Uyghur children and women abundantly in the channel to strike a chord within Muslims. The last one is about the aforementioned attack by IS in Afghanistan. Visuals like these give a glimpse of how the concept of the Uyghur genocide has been hijacked by this channel. The ones at the bottom are from the broadcast channel, which you can find in an ordinary legitimate news outlet, and which is mainly linked to the channel's legitimation strategy. So key takeaways. Our research has at least several implications for the CVE efforts. First, we need to analyze terrorist narratives constantly because continuous assessment of strategies employed by various terrorist groups across online platforms will contribute to a holistic understanding of how terrorist groups operate on various platforms and inform future responses on how to prevent the threat online. Farangiz?
Yeah, so just to also reiterate Kamil's point, continuing to study the terrorist narratives through frameworks such as the competitive system of meaning will help us shed light on how such groups use factual information coupled with their narratives and the interpretation of the situation to build the in-group and the out-group dynamic and justify the means to reach the ends.
Thank you. Yeah. Secondly, we need to analyze these narratives to develop alternative narratives because more often than not, terrorist groups address legitimate grievances of people, and they do it in rightful ways. They tell people, we know who are the moral agents of your suffering, so come to us, we have the solution, not your corrupt leaders. But their solutions are not the main problem here. The problem is that they involve violence, right? So that's why we need to step in with alternative narratives. In addition, alternative narratives are quintessential for individuals' breakaway from the groups through de-radicalization initiatives. And last,
I'll let you, I'm really sorry, but we're on a very tight schedule. I'm going to have to ask you just to wrap up very, very briefly because we've gone.
Okay, just last point. And the third one, analyzing such narratives are important to understand those societal and global problems that certain notorious countries use in driving wedges between people and their states or global institutions to cause fragmentation, mostly in Western democracies. So analysis of these narratives are also important to build resilience against such information operations and fragmentations. Thank you.
Interesting presentation, and I am so incredibly sorry that we didn't have time to explore those really important impact statements at the end and the impact of your research, but hopefully we can come back to it in the Q&A session. I'd like to move on to the next session really quickly, which is going to be Dr. Simon Copeland, again from Swansea University, who's going to be talking about insights into extremist supporters and how they navigate and exploit online platforms in the context of the emerging Trident division. So thanks very much, Simon.
So just to share my video, thank you very much for the introduction there. So yeah, my name is Dr. Simon Copeland, and I'm from Swansea University as well. And today I'm going to talk about one of the channels that we found in conducting this piece of research, which is Trident Division, and use them as a bit of a case study to understand how extremist supporters navigate and exploit online platforms. So just to give a bit of context to this research, in looking at the AWD affiliated Telegram channels that Joost mentioned at the start, one of the channels, this Trident Division channel, was a bit of an outlier because of the activities and the content that it was posting. So the group appears to be part of an online milieu that support and promote the far-right Azov regiment and other Ukrainian ultra-nationalist groups across Telegram and social media. So this digital milieu intersects and overlaps with various other online subcultures, including those of kind of far-right extremist communities, but also non-extremist ones, such as the tactical community of enthusiasts of highly stylized military and weapons-focused content on Instagram and TikTok. So whilst the data that we've gathered on this Telegram channel actually provides fairly little insight into Trident Division's ideological beliefs, one thing that is quickly apparent, as you can see from some of the images here, is that they're highly appreciative of right-wing Nazi and neo-Nazi aesthetics. Telegram polls conducted by the group also reveal that its audience is, like many other right-wing groups, very young and almost entirely under 20 years old. So in using this detailed data that we do have, though, actually about Trident Division, this allows us to then explore some of the wider questions about how extremist supporters navigate and exploit online platforms. So to move to kind of one of the first of these questions about how groups propagating extremism attempt to use multiple platforms, online platforms, how they respond to moderation and or bans. So significantly, messages posted by the administrator of the Trident Division Telegram channel provide an 18-month-long running commentary of their experiences and often actually their frustrations in trying to establish and maintain a presence across various social media platforms. So as the timeline here hopefully shows, Trident Division's had a series of Instagram accounts, despite these being repeatedly banned. It then moved to have a kind of short dalliance with YouTube that never really took off after a number of its videos were quite quickly taken down. And then more recently, it's moved towards TikTok and has managed to establish like a fairly significant audience there, despite its first account being deleted. So overall, the data reveals that the group has persisted with certain platforms rather than migrating elsewhere. And this is particularly interesting given that the group's admins have actually directly sought the opinions of the Telegram audience via the poll function as to where their content should be posted, and have actually acted in accordance with the results of this vote by continuing to use Instagram and creating yet another account. So for Trident Division, at least it appears that the decision to persist with certain platforms, in particular Instagram, is dictated from the bottom up, or the consumers of its content, as well as from its leadership or top down. Additionally, over the 18-month period that we've examined, we can also see evidence of Trident Division trying out new techniques and learning how to escape moderation on these platforms. So for example, when the group now announces new social media accounts on Telegram, rather than posting web links, which might be more susceptible to being picked up by computerized detection, the group have moved away to actually just sharing screenshots of the account details and letting people find them themselves. So to move on to how content is re-edited and repurposed for different platforms and audiences, one thing that was immediately apparent was that Trident Division's media outputs are designed to be kind of easily consumable within Telegram and on social media. The group doesn't appear to have any kind of physical presence on the ground in Eastern Ukraine or in any other conflict, but rather re-edits and reuses footage from propaganda films, other groups, and images, and takes these kind of material from other groups and re-edits them into its own distinctive, fast-paced, sort of 1 minute long edits. So, for example, in the top right corner, you can see on the screen here is the kind of the classic Azov video that often closely resembles the recruitment videos of Western militaries, with this very desaturated look and kind of slow, lingering shots on soldiers and weapons. And the Trident Division version, by contrast, is much snappier and much better suited to social media feeds where the content is viewed quite quickly and competes with the content for attention. The other image here on the left-hand side is actually a still from Trident Division re-edit of an Islamic State video that compresses the original narrative into this kind of a 1 minute kind of version of it. And aside from the shorter editing and the form of the video, this editing also tailors the content to an audience interested in primarily military aesthetics, kind of zooming in and slowing down on shots featuring the combat gear of Islamic State fighters and their firearms. And then additionally, one thing that Trident Division has been really keen to stress is their ambition to develop a repository of video, images, music, wallpapers and computer software that others can access and use to produce their own propaganda. So the group then is kind of both responsible for directly producing its own material that celebrates extremism, as well as facilitating others to do the same. So this kind of then begins to highlight the complexity of how content is created, reappropriated, and reused in the digital milieus that surround contemporary conflicts. And then moving on to the strategic purposes served by the content and form of Trident Division's outputs, one thing that was interesting was that virtually all of the 395 videos posted by the group in Telegram or on social media all share the same form, all being made up of these very short clips with stylized transitions, the sound from the videos removed and replaced with very fashionable soundtracks. So while some of the content here seems to be aimed at exploiting Instagram and TikTok's algorithms for pushing out posts, for example, including soldiers performing viral dances, this is largely actually undertaken through the form of the videos and how they've been edited. So, for example, the choice of music used in these videos appears highly strategic, often featuring remixes that merge multiple audio motifs or hooks that have or are trending on Instagram and TikTok to ensure that they're pushed out and receive greater attention on these platforms. And we also get very particular forms of editing, like the flash wave effect here applied to the picture in the background, in an effort to make kind of Azov propaganda appeal to slightly different audiences, like the alt-right here with this flash wave effect. Or we get the very close cropping on weapons and tactical gear, such as in the IS video mentioned, that speak to arms enthusiasts or tactical Instagram, as you might call it. And again, Trident Division appears to be keen to share these skills and techniques with other groups and content producers. For example, sharing specific TikTok remixes as audio files within its Telegram channel that include notes on the tempo, timings, and when kind of video cuts can be synced with them. So by way of offering some very brief conclusions and recommendations, I think it's important to be aware that extremist supporters demonstrate significant resilience in continuing to use certain platforms, even in the face of quite heavy moderation, and that this is something that may be dictated from the bottom up of their audience as well as the top down. Additionally, while we often focus on the content of extremist posts, it's important to recognize that the form of digital propaganda outputs now serve distinct strategic purposes, in particular to exploit social media algorithms and increase dissemination. Groups such as Trident Division appear adept at modifying content to exploit how it circulates on these different platforms, and are now intent on sharing this expertise with others around them. The example of Trident Division also highlight the complexity of actors within the digital milieux that surround contemporary conflicts, being both simultaneously producers, consumers, reappropriators, and facilitators of the creation of extremist content. And so just to conclude, all of these factors need to be taken into account when we're trying to understand and counter extremist supporters' use of these platforms. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Simon. It's such an interesting deep dive into the complex interactions. We've got so much to talk about, but I'm going to go straight on to Rees, also from Swansea, talking about IS exploitation of file sharing sites.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Let me just get my slides together. That's great. Hopefully everyone can see that. So hi everyone, especially worth a thanks to those of you in Australia. I realize it's quite late in the day there, so thanks for bearing with. My name's Rees. I'm from Swansea University. Today I'm going to be presenting on some work conducted by myself, Professor Stuart MacDonald, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, and Joost, who you've had the pleasure of meeting at the start of today's presentation. And the title of today's presentation is The Role of File Sharing Platforms in IS's Propaganda Strategy. And essentially what this research kind of builds on, just to jog your mind back to Joost's slides at the start, was the table at the end of Joost's brief introduction, which kind of pointed out that when we analysed what IS were outlinking to in terms of channels from their Telegram sort of channel, we found that 24 out of the top 30 were actually file sharing platforms. And essentially we approached this research with a sort of an air of curiosity. Why these platforms in particular? Why file sharing platforms? And today's work, I'm hopefully going to try and answer some of those questions. So the first sort of sub-question that we asked in order to answer the broader question was, were there sort of any key affordances, a combination of sort of key platform kind of traits and qualities that would make it appealing to IS, that would explain why these 24 file sharing platforms? And so we produced this measles chart. The x-axis along the top is a list of 12 sort of unique affordances. The y-axis is each of the 24 file sharing platforms in order of how many times they were outlinked to. And there's a few sort of takeaways, but just to sort of summarize and condense this into sort of 3 main points. The first was that the ability to post all content types, so whether image, video, PDF, and so on, was a key indicator. It was very common, but what we kind of expected to see alongside that was maybe more sort of generous sort of platform capabilities. And by that, I mean the ability to store large storage sizes, so more than 100 gigabytes, the ability to upload significant amounts of content in a given time, so more than 5 gigabytes. But what we sort of found was that platforms that had these affordances were sort of sporadic across the top 25 and accounted for less than half of the platforms, which came as quite a unique surprise. And so that didn't really seem to be a key indicator. So then we looked further across to whether file sharing platforms were being sort of used with a multi-purpose focus. So by that, I mean whether they were using the chat function or monetization to sort of create an additional stream of revenue, which you'll see towards the right end of this measles chart, was again not a common feature by any means. Only out of both of these categories, these qualities only existed in 4 platforms, and none of these platforms had both of these affordances. And so if not for sort of secondary purposes and significant upload sizes, we sort of expected to see anonymity to be sort of key in their intentions and their motives in picking up these platforms, the ability to sort of surf the web incognito. And we had sort of found that despite password protection being available in a significant majority of these platforms, most of the platforms were collecting PII, so personal identifiable information, and encryption, again, not being a significant sort of factor. Only 3 of the platforms in the top 10 out of this 24 had encryption available. And so we essentially stepped away from this and kind of sort of said that there weren't really any key identifiable factors that would suggest why IS were using any file sharing platform in particular. And so kind of building on from this, we asked the question, well, in line with some of the literature that exists, are file sharing platforms being used to evade content moderation to keep content live for longer periods of time? And so what we did was we went through the research, we went through the outlinks. Out of the 8,907 total outlinks, we manually explored, so clicked on each of the links for 26% of the sample. We'd like to have gone through the whole data set, but unfortunately, due to time constraints, we had to limit this to just over a quarter of the sample. We found that over 90% of the content had been taken down. And just to sort of frame this a little better, the first post that was outlinked to was from the 30th of July, 2021. And we sort of conducted this analysis towards the end of September. And so none of these links had been live for longer than 2 months, and yet still over 90% of the content had been taken down. And the 7.4% that hadn't been taken down is explainable in the sense that not all content that was being posted was extremist. Some of the links being posted to were blogs and sort of news articles and media reports, and so didn't deserve to be taken down for violating extremist sort of content terms of service. There's essentially a point to note here, which is that not live rate doesn't equal takedown rate. Some of this content would have been deleted, would have expired over the period, and made private and so on. But what this really suggests was that despite our sort of precursor knowledge, content wasn't being posted to these platforms to keep it live for a significant amount of time, which didn't answer our question of why these file sharing platforms, but was an interesting finding. And so based on these sort of first 2 questions, we kind of revisited the data with an open mind and tried to sort of come up with an explanation. And we'd found that one channel was responsible for over 90% of the outlinks, a bot channel that posted most of its content on the 30th and 31st of July, which quite clearly in the table that you can see in front of you suggests that it was an outlier. This bot account actually got subsequently taken down several days later. And sort of, if we were to analyze the behavior of this bot channel, it became clear that it wasn't so much that file sharing platforms were being used in order to keep content live for a significant period of time, but perhaps their ability to be paired with a bot channel in order to produce significant quantities of links. A point to note here also is that a lot of the content and a lot of the links were pointing to one piece of content, so multiple links pointing to a single piece of content. So content was being shared to file sharing platforms and kept live, but not in the way that maybe we once thought. And so to kind of bring this together, to list our discussions, our findings and our conclusions, it's quite clear that IS weren't picking file sharing platforms that had certain affordances. It's more, the takeaway here is more that regardless of what the quality and the sophistication of a file sharing platform, it likely will be or is being exploited by IS. And where content was being taken down, which obviously, as I pointed out earlier in the presentation, accounts for a significant portion of the sample. There's really a missed opportunity, we feel here. Companies like Moonshot are doing excellent work on the redirect method, and we feel that there's sort of an empty space here that could be filled with sort of redirect content for those looking to engage and pursue extremist content. Finally, then towards the bot end of bot side of the or component of the sort of research, we found that essentially bot accounts, although in our sample didn't account for a significant number of channels, the impact that just one bot could have was very significant, producing URLs en masse with the intention of producing significant amounts of URLs, so that if one piece of content gets taken down in 90%, there's still 10% that remains on the internet. So quantity rather than quality. And so what we think is significant here is not only does this apply to IS, but naturally right-wing extremists haven't sort of been subject to the same level of sort of content moderation that IS has to date. And so this sort of case study could be an early sort of precursor for right-wing extremist behavior in the future. Just finally, to point to future work, there's sort of avenues to explore whether URLs and file sharing platforms are being linked to in a certain order, whether there's a file sharing platform of preference that gets reposted to different platforms in the future. Certainly scope for future work here, but I think that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for the time and the opportunity. Cheers.
Thanks so much, Connor. I really appreciate you going through those. I know we're kind of whizzing through, but there's a lot to get through. And so last but absolutely not least, we return to our keynote speaker, who needs no introduction, Professor Maura Conway from Dublin City University, talk about facial profiles. So Maura, over to you.
Morning, everybody. Thanks, Rees, for the introduction. It's great to see you. And this work that I'm going to present builds on the work and the findings that have already been presented in a nice kind of way, I think. Like Joost said at the top of the panel, I'm presenting this work, but it's certainly not my work alone, and in particular, Atika Chabi and I worked on this. What we were interested in is usernames, in particular username selection practices, their purposes, so the kind of work that they do, if you like, in the online scene, and this question too of whether they can act as a means of detection and disruption. One of the first points that we wanted to make is that usernames matter. That usernames are a core component of contemporary social networking sites, as anybody who's been on any social networking platform, messaging application, online forum, or what have you, will have an awareness of. In fact, there's a lot of unanswered questions right up to the present time on the role of usernames in identity construction and their other purposes in the online world. There is some work that's been done in internet studies. It's not a massive amount of work, to be honest, and there's very, very little attention that has been paid to usernames in terms of their use and their purposes in online violent extremist and sort of terrorist adjacent communities. Very briefly, some of the major functions of usernames and also, I guess I would say, of profile pictures. So there's some considerable overlap here. And number one, they're a way for users to express their personal identities and sort of some sort of unique aspect, if you like, oftentimes of these identities. When we're talking about the online extremist and terrorism scenes, very often usernames are employed to signal adherence to some ideology or movement or group or cause or what have you. They make it very easy if somebody has done that. So if some user has signaled their adherence to, for example, some group in this way, this makes it easy for other users who are like-minded to identify and to connect with these users. And so fourthly, I would say usernames in conjunction with other characteristics of users' personal profiles can really aid in building relationships and growing communities online. What I would say about this particular analysis is that it's a very preliminary assessment. It's was built on the data that the lads have just also discussed. An issue here was we didn't have as much data to base our analysis on, precisely because of the public nature of the channels that were collected. And so there's less actual personal usernames as it was contained in the data. So maybe only 100 or so for each. So this is preliminary. We were trying to think things through, because what we want to do is a larger scale study going forward. And as already pointed out, this is IS data on the one hand and Atamuradova username data on the other hand, and it's all drawn from the Telegram messaging application. Very briefly, our findings. Historically, as it were, in inverted commas, many IS, Telegram, but also Twitter, Facebook, and other major platforms that they were once active on. These usernames that were used by IS showed really unambiguous support for the group. So oftentimes they would use, for example, in those names, the names of major figures within the group, or a variety of other markers that showed support for the organization. In fact, Atamuradovan's supporters on Telegram continue to have usernames that act as unambiguous markers of their commitment to hate and violence. So there's an immediate distinction that can be drawn between IS supporters use of usernames contemporarily versus Atamuradova supporters contemporary use of usernames. What was commonplace amongst IS users and is commonplace amongst AWD supporters is their use of subcultural languages, including code words and numbers, their use of emojis and whatnot in usernames. Gender is often also signaled. This is true across online communities, not just on Telegram, not just amongst extremists and terrorism supporters. And I guess the main finding we would say is that IS supporters' loss of their signaling capacity via their usernames in Telegram has really resulted in the erosion of social connections and some of the power of these communities on the platform. And I'm going to show you an illustration right now of a sort of then and now approach. These are made up. It has to be said, but they're made up on the basis of actual data, as it were. So in the past, you can see on the screen there where it says handles or screen names, then they actually had meaning. And what you see there is screen names that refer to major figures within so-called Islamic states, like, for example, Al-Adnani on top there. References to the conflict, for example, Shami is Syria in Arabic. Also, for example, reference to the IS magazine, Dabik, and what have you. So this goes to our point that once upon a time, it was relatively straightforward to identify supporters of IS on Telegram and on other platforms via their usernames, in conjunction also with other information. Right now, what you get is names that sort of appear like what's on in the other column, so the now column, as it were. And one of the things a lot of users do, not just on Telegram, but on a diversity of other platforms, is just to use fairly meaningless names that are combined of letters and numbers. Sometimes actually this is also used by bots too, so sometimes there's a difficulty in distinguishing between them. Some users still use names that are, you know, less meaningless than the ones you see in the now in the now column on your screen, but very, very few are using the meaningful usernames that you see in the other column called then. All of this is in relation to so-called Islamic State supporters and their usernames. In fact, AWD users can still really quite easily identify ideological fellow travelers on the Telegram platform, because many of them are still using usernames that appear like this. Again, this isn't an actual username, it's a made-up one, but there are quite a large number of usernames that are being employed by AWD supporters on Telegram that look something like this. In other words, many of them signal their commitments with not just the text and the actual names used, but also via their use of emojis and what have you. And very popular ones amongst AWD supporters are, for example, this lightning bolt rune, which is associated with the SS in Nazi Germany. Also, this eagle, skull and crossbones, and you know, a variety of other emojis and images that are that are employed still by them. So very briefly, what are the policy implications of all of this, and where do we plan to go next? I guess one of the things I'd say is that maybe to many of you, this seems obvious, because as researchers, I think we've had an awareness of this for some time, though we haven't actually empirically showed it this as far as I'm aware to date, not in a really substantive way. But even if it's obvious to us, it very oftentimes isn't obvious to a lot of people who set up sort of new platforms, also quite small platforms, where they just don't have the same kind of knowledge about these online extremist and terrorist scenes. So that's one thing. The second thing we wanted to say is that our strong feeling is that we need more extensive and detailed empirical research identifying the characteristics of usernames in order, I guess I would say, to do a variety of different things, but at least one thing is to develop innovative ways of detecting violent extremist activity online. So we think what's necessary is research across time in order to determine changes in username selection practices across platforms, obviously, so not just Telegram, but other platforms, that this should be done in conjunction with other identity markers, for example, profile pictures. And then thirdly, I guess I would say, there's a utility, we believe, in further cooperation between researchers and platforms in particular, but probably also law enforcement and others professionally tasked in this area to share knowledge on the role and characteristics of usernames in community building and takedown. And then finally, and I think this is already obvious, usernames can of course complement other means for early detection and disruption. The really obvious one is profile pictures, but also marquee images, keyword lists, and what have you. So basically what we're doing is we've done this very preliminary analysis. We need to collect more data, and we're going to combine this username analysis with a profile picture analysis for a more sort of 360-degree view of things. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Maura, and thank you so much for starting and finishing. That's quite a task. What was such an interesting series of presentations, and it really all spoke to me very much about the importance of that layered approach that looks at community and social communities that are so pivotal, and how violent extremists from a range of different organizations and ideologies utilize and innovate on various different platforms, and the challenges that that poses us as the people who are looking at them. And I have got a range of different questions for the presenters. A lot of them focus very much on the tools, so I'll start very quickly on those. And so the first question is for Kamil and Farangiz, and it asks whether or not you drew on content analysis tools such as Luke or linguistic, I believe it is, I can't remember what it stands for.
LIWC.
Yes, thank you very much. And whether or not you use these kind of tools, similarly to Paul Gill's grievance library for Luke, to conduct any behavioural analysis when you were doing your work on Islamic State channels on Telegram.
Thanks, David, for the question. No, we didn't use those tools. We are aware of those tools, but instead we used several NLP techniques, like natural language processing techniques using Python, which includes some word cloud analysis, frequency analysis, bigram network analysis, bigram meaning like word pair analysis, and more importantly, topic modeling. So topic modeling enables us as researchers to extrapolate meanings in an inductive way. So with the results of these 4 types of analysis, then we went on and we qualitatively looked into those topics or issues that we saw in these analyses and matched the meanings with these strategies. And that's why in my presentation, I said, these strategies may or may not be intended by the users, but from a discourse analysis perspective, it's not that important, because the illocutionary force of the narratives are still there regardless of users intending or not.
Thank you very much. Just moving on to Simon, I was really struck by the interactions between those users and the content producers, and that kind of blurring of those lines, particularly when you were talking about the poll and the responsiveness, which is something that we've seen in our kind of work on YouTube around how channel owners curate their community in really careful ways. The question that I've got from those online is asking you about again tools in terms of how you analyze the different components and images. Did you use human analytic classifications or standard classifications? Whether there was a difference between the kind of the video and the text, the video and the images as well.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that's a really interesting point about the how the kind of the lines are being blurred there. And one thing we did see in terms of these videos, which I've not seen anywhere before, is actually people asking Trident Division to produce videos for them and offering to pay to have their videos created. In terms of actually the how we went through and analyzed the videos. So the videos we manually coded and went through those. Because we had such a big archive of them, we didn't go too deeply into those, but we didn't use any software. That was all manually done by myself and another researcher. But what we did do, we did do reverse image searches on the images that the group had shared. because we thought that was interesting, because what they were sharing was a number of before and after images of how this is how you can edit images to kind of serve our purposes, and to kind of give them that certain kind of look. And what we did find is that a lot of them were stock images that were taken from Western militaries, which we think is part of a kind of a campaign, again, to kind of normalize and legitimize some of these groups, in particular the Azov regiment. So I hope that answers your questions.
I think that is the idea of how you use images from different sources to create a story, I think is really interesting. And also the amount of technical skill that goes into producing that kind of slick and capacity is really telling on the organization in and of itself. You know, you often just look at the platform, but I think, you know, that level of expertise that it requires, which really like made me think, Connor, when in your presentation about the use of bots and whether or not the bots were coming from within the groups themselves, or whether other people are using those bots, and how the bots serve multiple platforms as well, and what your kind of thoughts were on digging down into those kind of that bot activity.
It's an interesting question. It's something that I don't think we anticipated coming sort of into contact with, but I think it offers quite a daunting prospect, the use of bots. That just in our data set alone, the sort of influence that one bot channel could have, I think if that was kind of adopted on scale across a number of different groups and all using this sort of wide variety of platforms, I think it really kind of lights a fire that we really need to be proactively looking at things like spam detection and things outside of the sort of CPVE remit. Yeah, it's daunting, and it's something that we need to sort of maybe be prioritizing, not just being aware of. Yeah, very interesting stuff. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, and you know, I think, like, I know, Maura, you talk a lot about ethics, and it was really interesting to see the use of public data. My own research has always looked at public data, and it causes a lot of challenges, particularly when sites change their term of services, like Gab has done. And also, I think it's challenging because sometimes when we look at the public stuff, we miss that on-offline kind of capability. And we have another question that's pointing to this idea that, can we find out about people's offline life? If we can't, have you searched wider outside these specific sites to think about what personality profiles exist in the broader context? Particularly, I'm thinking about subcultures that are drawn on, and how that could be used to discover more about the terms. And related to that, there was also a question, I'm just going to provide them with you because we're running out of time, around the discrepancy between IS and AWD groups, and that suggests a double standard in the enforcement of content moderation rules, or are there other factors influencing this?
Yeah, thanks, Rees. Thanks, David and Zia, for your questions. On this question of real life in inverted commas versus sort of online life, the short answer to that is no, we haven't. I guess when I think about this, I think less about online and offline and more about maybe tracing activity across a diversity of platforms, which I think there is absolutely not a straightforward thing to do, but might be easier to do in some instances than to make that online-offline connection. Having said that, there are researchers in this space who have done work where they do seek to make this online-offline connection. For example, there is a paper from, it's probably at least 10 years ago now, about online forums where sort of neo-Nazi and other extreme right forums, where a researcher reached out to the users and actually did a survey. I think probably about 100 or so users communicated with her, and they made some of these connections. So it's certainly not impossible. So that's one thing. Secondly, Lisa, you mentioned terms of service, and you mentioned Gab or what have you, and I'm just going to take the opportunity to say there's good work in internet studies about terms of service, and this question of ethics and terms of service. And a researcher called Casey Biesler in the US has done really great work about this. And there's also interesting court decisions now in the US about this also. So this is one I think we'll maybe have to revisit, because I guess my main point here is that terms of service and ethics are not necessarily always and everywhere congruent. And then the last question was from Zia with respect to AWD and IS usernames, and whether the differences that we can see in the usernames is down to different attitudes to this content. And the short answer is absolutely yes. And in an article from a couple of years ago now, some colleagues and I used this term differential disruption. At that time, we were talking about IS versus other jihadis, and the way in which IS is much more disrupted, even right now up to the present time, than other jihadi organizations. And the same now is certainly also true. Violent jihadi organizations are more disrupted than extreme right organizations in general. So yes, there definitely is differential disruption ongoing.
So I have so many questions to ask all of you. Thank you, David. Thank you, Zia. And thank you to our panelists for an absolutely fantastic session to end day 2. I really have enjoyed hearing you all, and the research that you're doing is so interesting and so important as well. And I just wish we had more time. I want to thank you, and I also want to highlight that we are back tomorrow morning, bright and early, Australian Eastern something time, EST I think it's called, for an 8 o'clock start, where we're going to have a session on wings of change, communities and violent extremist prevention. And so hopefully you'll all be able to join us online. Thank you to all of the participants for coming from your various different time zones. And once again, thank you all to the panelists for joining me on this session.
Thanks, Rees. Thanks, everybody.
Good
night, Australia.
Thank you so much. Cheers.
Thank you.